If Jesus is saying, don't start something that you can't finish, don't bite off more than you can chew. And in many places in life, that would be good advice. In a fight or in a PhD thesis, building a tower or fighting a war, don't start something you can't finish would be great advice. But when it comes to the spiritual life, it seems like it's bad advice. Because in the spiritual life, we have neither the power to begin nor the power to finish. The essence of the spiritual life is recognizing our neediness, our dependence on God's help. It is God's initiative which starts the Christian life within us, and God's initiative which brings it to fruition in our lives. So what's going on? What is Jesus talking about when he compares our discipleship with a man who builds a tower and has a plan? Well, there's two types of calculation going on in the examples that Jesus gives, but they're both more or less the same. We have the constructive example of building a tower and the destructive example of fighting a war. But in both of those examples, there are what I think Donald Rumsfeld called unknown unknowns. There are things that are unknown which threaten to derail the plan. And there are, of course, known unknowns, unpredictable elements of life which threaten to derail the ideas that we have. But what's clear in their mind is the goal. They know what they're aiming for, and they're trying to negotiate the uncertainties of the price that must be paid, the sacrifices that must be made. And Jesus is drawing attention to the way in which Christianity is radically different. In the case of following Christ, we know very well what the cost will be. We know very well that the price we will have to pay is nothing less than everything. If we are to follow Christ, we must be willing to pay even our lives. Everything must be given to the Lord. But what we don't fully know, what we can only faintly intuit here and now, is the full glory of God's plan for our lives and the world. The first reading makes it very clear. Who can discern the counsel of the Lord? Who can fathom the riches of God's love and mercy? For the reasoning of mortals compared to the wisdom of God is worthless, and our designs are likely to fail. So in saying yes to Christ, in taking up our cross, we must say no to many of the plans and designs of our heart. And this will be a repeated and generous self-offering. The Lord doesn't say he who accepts his cross in a one-time offering, but the person who continually bears that cross, continually follows the Lord, continually lays aside those designs and plans of their heart. Now, none of that means that our plans are worthless. It doesn't mean that we should plunge from the extreme of trying to plan out every facet of our life to the opposite of simply abandoning ourselves to the chaos of life. But it means that our plans, if they are to be Christian plans, our hopes and our dreams must always be porous to God's activity, must always be held up to the light of God's love, and be prepared to be disrupted. Be prepared for God to show us that he has something more glorious, more loving, more wonderful than the finite, small apprehensions of our world. So our plans are but provisional anticipations of that great plan which God gives us in Christ. And since God has disclosed his mercy in Christ, God has given us the definitive sign of his love for us in Christ. The abandonment of everything is not irrational, but perfectly rational. It's perfectly rational because it is taken in a relationship of love in which God, the God we know, is the God to whom we can entrust everything, the God who cares about our flourishing and our well-being. And so far from telling us not to bite off more than we can chew, I think Jesus is inviting us to do the very opposite. He's inviting us to do something truly marvelous with him, to do more than we can imagine for ourselves, because we do it through, with, and in him. In the end, the parable isn't about planning. It isn't about our anxieties about life. It isn't about biting off more than we can chew. It's a story about God. It's a disclosure of God's character, the God who will always surprise us by exceeding our hopes, by fulfilling our dreams, and by breaking open our finite plans.